Vicki has a background in nutrition science, dietetics, epidemiology, and public health, and her research areas include population-based cohort studies and clinical trials to reduce chronic disease. Vicki has over 200 peer-reviewed publications in the scientific literature and supervises several research students. She's passionate about applying research into the clinical and community context and translating research into practice. Please welcome Professor Vicki Flood. Thanks, Vicki.
So this evening I'm going to walk you through talking about healthy diet patterns in general and healthy aging. I'm going to make reference to Mediterranean diet and anti-inflammatory diets and where we see the importance of those diets in some general chronic disease contexts. And it'll become apparent as I go through it what's the link there with age-related macular degeneration. I worked for many years on the Blue Mountains eye study cohort study, and I did that work for my PhD in the late 90s, and I had an ongoing connection with that cohort study over time. And then I've, in more recent years, been exploring nutrition and neurodegenerative diseases, in particular dementia, and I'm interested in this connection that's just emerging in the literature now between macular degeneration and dementia. And I'm going to give you a few bit of practical tips for putting it into practice too. We'll see how far we can get in the course of an hour, or less for me. And so I've started here with a picture of a world map and with a few highlighted areas, and they're known as the blue zones. And I'm guessing a few of you are already familiar with what's the significance of the blue zones. We know that people who live in these areas of the world, in these locations, live healthily for a longer period of time, and particularly up to 100 years. And so we're interested to think about what are some of the dietary patterns that those people are consuming. And when you look at some of the healthy lifestyle factors that they're doing and their diet, here's some of the common features of locations across the world. And in the centre, we see that people who live in these blue zones have largely consumed a plant-based diet. It's anti-inflammatory in nature. It's high in legumes, dark green leafy veggies. They're fairly physically active, and they have some social engagement, and they're non-smokers traditionally. So just some common features about those individuals, it is interesting to consider as we think about diet patterns and chronic disease. Now, I'm sorry if my dog at the background is disturbing. You can see a little picture of him in the background there in my image, and he's just having a little bark at the moment. Now, in terms of the very commonly investigated dietary pattern is the Mediterranean diet pattern. And we know that that's high in grains, vegetables and fruit, has moderate amounts of fish and seafood, and lower amounts of poultry, eggs, yogurt, and meat and sweets. But fundamental to all of the Mediterranean diet patterns is this social connectedness and being physically active, enjoying connections with other people. It's recognised by the UNESCO as intangible cultural heritage, and it's also acknowledged in our dietary guidelines in Australia. We wrote a paper on it a few years ago around the evolution of Mediterranean diets and cuisine with a very good PhD student, Sue Radvaginis, and it unpacks that further. And I've, in this slide here, described some of the key elements of the Mediterranean diet and why they are important from a nutrient point of view and its health impact. So we see where it's a diet high in extra virgin olive oil, nuts, dark green leafy vegetables, legumes. It has particular types of cooking methods that are moist in nature, and it has a lot of herbal teas and water, and uses lemon juice and vinegar mixed together with extra virgin olive oil for dressings. And that combination of factors, as you can see described there, are very important from a point of view of nutrient content, but also have impacts in terms of health. And I'm not going to go into all the details of those right now, but we'll see how that emerges in relation to macular degeneration and other chronic diseases as I go through this further. There was an important trial in Europe a number of years ago where they investigated people who are high risk for cardiovascular disease. They had over 7,000 people, men and women, who are high risk of cardiovascular disease with type 2 diabetes, or they had three of the following: smoking, hypertension, elevated LDL cholesterol, low high-density lipoprotein cholesterol, or overweight or obese, and a family history of chronic heart disease. And they randomized them to receive three different types of diet: Mediterranean diet with extra virgin olive oil, a Mediterranean diet pattern with nuts provided, or compared it to the lower fat diet, which at the time was the current advice. There was no energy restriction or no calorie restriction, and no particular information around physical activity in this intervention. Then they followed them up over time. And over time, they found, this is the control diet in the top line here, and the Mediterranean diet with the nuts and the Mediterranean diet with the extra virgin olive oil, they found that there was a reduced cumulative incidence for myocardial infarction, for cardiovascular disease events. So heart attack, stroke, or death from cardiovascular disease. And that was significantly different to the control diet of the low-fat diet. And that was published in New England Journal of Medicine a few years ago, 2018. There was a spin-off study from that work that investigated dementia risk and cognitive function. And so in a subset of that same trial, we saw that in those three RCTs with the smaller numbers were people who received the Mediterranean diet with extra virgin olive oil and nuts had improved cognitive function. They're in the lighter coloured bars compared to those who were in the low-fat diet. So we see consistently occurring that the Mediterranean diet was protective in cognitive function scores over time. At a time when people are aging, when there's usually some reduction in their cognitive function scores. And that was a very well-run randomized controlled trial over a period of time. Now, similar to the map I showed you previously, there's increasing interest in anti-inflammatory diets. And here's a map of the world again with examples of where there are anti-inflammatory diets and some of the common features of them. And I guess I wanted to just show here, there's some common elements to what of the locations that I showed you previously, but it's looking at it from the point of view of inflammation. What are the causes? What are the types of foods that are pro-inflammatory, and what are the types of foods that are anti-inflammatory? And we see this Western diet pattern that is pro-inflammatory versus the anti-inflammatory diets that are high in olive oil, fruit, nuts, legumes, fish, and seafoods. And this is being measured by assessing inflammatory markers and a variety of health outcomes in relation to anti-inflammatory diet. So it's this Mediterranean diet is an example of an anti-inflammatory diet. So we know there's a strong relationship between chronic disease, diabetes, vascular health, and cognition, and inflammation, insulin resistance, hyperglycemia are some of the mechanisms in relation to that relationship. Now, in terms of macular degeneration, I spent a bit of time introducing, the healthy diet patterns and other chronic disease, but we know that people who have early AMD or more advanced late macular degeneration, they're at a higher risk for cardiovascular disease mortality, so much higher risk. So this was from our Blue Mountains Eye study data, which I'll share more information about the Blue Mountains Eye study cohort in a moment. But just briefly, those people who had early macular degeneration had 2.3 times the risk of cardiovascular disease mortality. Those people who had late macular degeneration were 5.5 times the risk of cardiovascular mortality. And those people with late macular degeneration had 10 times the risk of cardiovascular stroke mortality. And so there's an important relationship between our vascular health and our eye health. And coming back to this point about inflammation in the diet, why that might be important for our health and our brain function and our vascular function overall, there's a range of different theories around that that's still being investigated. But the view is that overall inflammation and from a pro-inflammatory diet increases our T cell response, increases cytokines, increases the high sensitive C-reactive protein. And so we see that, we can measure that from the blood. And of course, an anti-inflammatory diet, we have a healthy gut, we have low toxins, it's increased fiber intake, and we suppress inflammatory markers, suppress tumor necrosis factor. And I'll explain the importance of that in this next little study I'm going to talk about. This was a study that was conducted among guinea pigs, just as a way of example of some of the scientific mechanisms behind this. And in this study, they gave the guinea pigs a high saturated fat diet to induce hypercholesteremia and poor liver function and poor eye function too. And then in half the guinea pigs, they gave them a high dose of lutein. And we see lutein as a carotenoid that's in dark green leafy vegetables. And the group that received the lutein had improved inflammatory markers that are found in the eye and the liver. And here's an example of the pro-inflammatory cytokines that we see, that reduced inflammatory marker of tumor necrosis factor and the other, the interleukin cytokine there. So, and we see that this had an effect on improving the function of both their liver and their eye health in these guinea pigs. So guinea pigs were an interesting group of animals to study in relation to this, because they have some similar needs for lutein as we see in the human body as well. And so we're increasingly becoming interested in the elements that work together in relation to our brain health and our overall vascular health, but it affects liver and eye as well. So now I come to the Blue Mountains Eye Study, which I conducted my PhD with Blue Mountain Eye Study in the late 90s, and around the second wave of data collection. This was first studied in the early 90s to 92 to 94 was the first cohort that we investigated the people living in the Blue Mountains, and 5 years later we investigated them again, and for 2 other subsequent periods. And it has a large group of investigators in the study group, and I'd like to acknowledge my co-investigators here. This was led by Professor Paul Mitchell, the ophthalmologist Professor Paul Mitchell, and others. So this is a really important research translation story. This picture here of the 3 sisters in front of the 3 sisters. It was based on a population-based cohort study of people aged 49 years and over, and it was very comprehensively recruited from the 2 postcoded areas in the Blue Mountains. As I said, the baseline study was 92 to 94. It's over 3,500 people in that baseline study period. And then we tested them each subsequently 5 years. The population that were predominantly Caucasian, but for that location, it was representative of that population. We assessed their diet with a food frequency questionnaire, and we had detailed dietary estimates of their diet in approximately 80% of those that we had clinical examinations with. And that was maintained fairly much throughout the period of the subsequent investigations. Of course, in age-related macular degeneration, which many of you would be very familiar with, affects the macula, the central part of the retina, affects 1 in 7 people aged over 50 in Australia, and leading cause of blindness, particularly in relation to late macular degeneration, if it's progressive. And here's a picture of a healthy retina versus an unhealthy retina. It can take a form of a dry or a wet form, becoming quite sudden vision loss in some instances, and affects people's central vision. You would be familiar that there are many well-known risk factors in relation to macular degeneration, and I'm, of course, concentrating on the diet element in relation to that today. But just to put that into a little bit of context in relation to smoking, I think I just deserve a quick mention here because it's such an important modifiable risk factor. And we know that the toxic compounds in cigarette smoking increases the oxidative damage to the retina. affects the epithelium, somewhat like in any vascular effect that the toxic compounds of cigarette smoking has. So it's really important that we encourage smoking cessation among people who have macular degeneration, and in order to reduce risk overall. But it is important to note that people who have had a history of smoking, and current smokers, past smokers, that they should avoid taking high-dose beta-carotene supplements, and that become clear why that's important as I talk further. And the Cancer Council actually recommends avoiding any but beta-carotene supplements of greater than 18 milligrams. And this applies to people who are smokers, because we know there's been a randomized control trial from the early 2000s that showed that there was convincing evidence of high-dose beta-carotenes increase the risk of lung cancer. It wasn't just among smokers, it was also people exposed to asbestos. And so that could be a large proportion of the population, particularly historically speaking. We have less exposure to asbestos now, thankfully. So the main nutrients that we're interested in particular in macular degeneration are the nutrients of carotenoids, lutein and zeaxanthin, and found in green leafy vegetables. The green leafy vegetables may also be really important from a point of view of their nitrate content as well. And fruits are protective and provide vitamin C and flavonoids, and a diet low in glycemic index from whole grains and legumes are important, as is fish. And I'll go through and explain some of the evidence that we have around those factors. So the reason why those nutrients are likely to be important is because of their antioxidant effect in relation to eye disease. We know that the retina is very susceptible to oxidative damage. It's exposed to a lot of light. It is very rich in polyunsaturated fatty acids. So anything that's rich in polyunsaturated fatty acids can be susceptible to oxidative damage. And so antioxidants, therefore, are protective. And so it helps to keep the cell functioning well. That combination of you've got a milieu, you've got an environment of high polyunsaturated fatty acids that are needed for good health of the macula, and that combination with the antioxidants from the vitamins I've just talked about is very important. And of course, the macula is concentrated in carotenoids, in lutein and zeaxanthin, that gives it that yellow colour. And it reduces, and we know that lutein and zeaxanthin also act to reduce amyloid beta plaques. And the nitrates that I mentioned before in the dark green leafy vegetables will also assist with vasodilation of the blood vessels. So this is part of the little micro blood vessels in the eye are kept healthy by this combination of nutrients. Zinc, as you're probably aware, that it's also found in a supplement that was tested in the big randomized control trial in the US, which I'll talk about further in a moment. That is a cofactor for good antioxidant enzyme functioning, and hence why we think zinc is important as well. Now, in the Blue Mountains Eye study, over a period of time, we looked at the range of nutrients, foods, and macular degeneration outcomes over time. And of course, we had detailed eye examinations of all the individuals examined, so we could look to see if they had any signs and symptoms of macular disease at the beginning of the study and follow them over time. So what we find is people who were consuming diets higher in lutein and zeaxanthin, in the highest tertile of that compared to those who were in the lowest, they had about a 65% reduction in risk for macular degeneration over a 10 years of follow-up. And in general, vegetables overall, those in the highest third of the vegetable intake, had about a 36% reduction in risk reduction. So with those, it's just a bit of an indication that those nutrients were important. We'd already thought that from the science, but you see it confirmed in a longitudinal cohort study. Now, I just want to turn a little bit to omega-3 fatty acids. The omega-3 fatty acid, docosahexaenoic acid, that's the DHA, that's found in very high concentrations in the human retina. and yet it's shed regularly, and so we have a high turnover. We have a high need for it to be frequently restored and be renewed, and so it continues to be a requirement for us. So we can make it from shorter chain fatty acids, but it takes a lot of shorter chain fatty acids to elongate it, to make it longer in our body. And so it's easier if we consume it by consuming it in sources, long-chain omega-3 fatty acids in fish. You can get it in nuts and seeds as well, but the longer chain is found in fish. And so we know it's important for cell membrane maintenance, retinal pair repair following oxidative stress. And hence it probably works synergistically with the antioxidants. And we do also know from other vascular health that omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids are important for reducing risk for plaque development of the blood clots. So again, keeping the blood supply and the blood vessels healthy in the retina. So in our study, in Blue Mountains Eye study, we found at 5 years initially, we investigated the fish consumption that people were consuming. And we found those people who had a regular fish consumption had about a 40% reduced risk for early AMD. And those who had it even more frequently, there was an indication, though it didn't quite reach significance, they had about a 75% reduced risk for late AMD. We didn't see any significant effect of nuts at that first 5 year study, but we went on to investigate that in 10 years, and I'll share some more data about that in a moment. We saw similar results for the fish at the 10-year study as this one. And just to remind you where we get our long-chain omega-3 fatty acid sources, but particularly in the fatty fish that in cold waters like salmon, but even canned fish. And a lot of the participants of the Blue Mountains Eye study were consuming their fish from canned sources, from salmon and tuna. And so it didn't necessarily have to be as an expensive form of fish. And that was convenient for the older residents too, because they can store that, they can buy that in the supermarket easily at a reasonably economically, and they can store it in their cupboard and consume it that way. So a lot of them were consuming their fish that way. But you can see the concentration of long-chain omega-3 fatty acids does drop off. But if you're regularly eating, say, even canned tuna, that you would be able to get a satisfactory amount of long-chain omega-3 fatty acids. I just show here a couple of other items that have long-chain omega-3 fatty acids in them. Fortified egg does, but not to the same extent, but it's not an unreasonable amount of long-chain omega-3 fatty acids. But you can see that the fortified bread, by contrast, has quite a tiny amount of long-chain omega-3 fatty acids. So that's probably not a good source of relying on a fortified product in that way. So now just going back to the nuts story, when we investigated the nuts intake and 10-year incident AMD in the Blue Mountains Eye study, we found that those people who were regularly having nuts around 1 to 2 serves a week had a 35% reduced risk overall of early AMD. And it seemed to be particularly important for regular consumption of nuts for reducing their risk for drusen and other pigment abnormalities. So we saw this protective effect. Now, of course, around the same time as we were doing this work in our longitudinal cohort study, there was a couple of other significant cohort studies going on in the world, Rotterdam Eye Study and the Beaver Dam Eye Study. This randomized clinical trial was occurring in the US, known as the AREDS one. And they recruited people who already had macular degeneration. Macular AMD. And they were aged 55 to 80 years, about 3,500 people they recruited, and they randomized them to receive different combinations of supplements. So the supplements were either a placebo or the antioxidant combination there of vitamin C, beta carotene, vitamin E, and zinc, or the combination or zinc only, or the combination of antioxidants and zinc. And those who received the combination of antioxidants and zinc, this is measuring progression of the disease here, so people who had AMD categories 1 to 2, progressing to 3 and 4, they were less likely to progress compared to those who received the placebo, to the later, more progressed forms of the disease, if they received this supplement combination. And the most protective, all of them were protective of the supplement combinations, but the most protective was the combination of antioxidants and zinc. But remember what I said at the beginning about the work that was being done on clinical trials and cancer risk. And this work was being published around the same time as the AREDS 1 work was occurring. So at the time when they first started this study, they didn't know about that cancer risk. And then that subsequently came out in other research that was occurring. And so now we're very cautious, even though that doesn't reach 18 milligrams, we are still very cautious that that's a fairly high dose when you consider how much a recommended dietary intake is, which I've shown there in brackets. So that was a concern around that formulation. Otherwise, it was quite protective in relation to slowing progression of the disease. And we, meanwhile, had published lutein and zeaxanthin results and our vegetable results. Others had published something similar. The work that we'd done on long-chain omega-3 fatty acids was already also published in our cohort study. So then they wanted to investigate, well, maybe the carotenoids needed a further investigation. So they did an AREDS 2 study where they looked specifically at lutein and zeaxanthin, those carotenoids, dark green leafy vegetables, and they looked at a combination of different types of fatty acids, long-chain omega-3 fatty acids. They used both DHA and EPA with emphasis on EPA. It's a fairly complicated design because they were aware that they had some people, they already knew that there was a protective effect from the AREDS 1 formulation. So it meant for complexity in the design, but they had some groups who received no beta-carotene, and there was 2 groups like that, and they specifically looked out for people who were smokers to make sure that they didn't have the high dose beta-carotene. And then they followed them up over a period of time and looked to see what the results were. Now, it's interesting. This is a complicated design because it's layered with the fact that they're already receiving what we know would be protective. Now, I'm just going to show you one table from this results. This is of the people who had either had a combination of lutein and zeaxanthin compared to those who had no lutein and zeaxanthin. So that's the treatment group received lutein and zeaxanthin compared to the control group of those who didn't. And what they did differently in AREDS 2 that they hadn't done the first time around, they accounted for or they investigated what people were consuming naturally in their diet as well. And I think this was a really important step that they took. And they found that people who had a really low background dietary intake, so see that quintile 1 in that first line there, those people, if you look at that red circle there, those people who had the treatment with lutein and zeaxanthin in the combination with a low background diet of lutein and zeaxanthin, so in other words, they're not eating very healthily, they had a protective effect. It reduced their likelihood of more advanced progression of age-related macular degeneration. But it didn't have an effect if they were already having quite a bit of lutein and zeaxanthin in their diet. So it was only in the people who had in the lowest fifth of the background dietary intake that was protective. So that was a really important sort of piece of work that they showed. And it was consistent with what we were seeing in the longitudinal cohort studies, which, of course, is not giving people a supplement, but we're watching what they're doing over time. So that AREDS 2 formulation contained 10 milligrams of lutein, 2 milligrams of zeaxanthin, the vitamin C and the E. We got rid of the beta-carotene out of that, and that's the new AREDS 2 formulation that is recommended. But you'll still see some formulations with the beta-carotene, and it just needs to be aware of the other risks. I just want to show you in this slide here that the carotenoids of lutein and zeaxanthin, this is their formulaic structure, and they're quite similar, as you can see. They're sort of isomers of each other. But you see when you could compare it to the formula structure of beta-carotene, it's fairly similar in look. And there is a bit of thought that it's not been confirmed, but it's been suggestive in some animal studies that there may be some competition in the tissue between beta carotene and lutein and zeaxanthin, but that's still to be further investigated. I also want to point out from this piece of work that we published back in the early 2000s with a very good master's student, that while lutein and zeaxanthin is very rich and high in things like silver beet and the dark green leafy vegetables, we actually get a lot of our lutein and zeaxanthin from more commonly consumed foods like broccoli and green beans, because they were more frequently consumed in our population group. So while they're not as concentrated, there's still good sources of it. So just to bear that in mind. So we then subsequently did some work of looking at how do we practically get that lutein and zeaxanthin in a diet, given that, you've got both the Blue Mountains Eye study, a longitudinal cohort study showing it's good for us. And we're thinking about it in terms of, the background diet of the work from the AREDS too. And so we published this sort of more practical paper that gave an indication of what types of foods you could consume to get a good source of daily intake of lutein and zeaxanthin. And so you can get them in things like pistachio nuts and oranges. You have pistachio nuts, so that little green husk around the nuts. Eggs have some in them, particularly the fortified eggs, and the chickens are fed marigolds and dark green leafy veggies. That helps with them having a higher lutein content of the eggs. Obviously, baby spinach is a great source. Other greens, as I've mentioned, blueberries. And so that combination in a fairly good, healthy diet, but is a way of consuming diet from your food source. I've put in that picture there of warrigal greens, which is a traditional food as available in Australia. We also did some work on glycemic index, and just keeping an eye on the time. I think I've just got time to cover this one off. And we found that people who had a higher diet with a high glycemic index had an increased risk for macular degeneration. And we found at the same time, we were very careful to adjust for dietary fibre. And so we found that dietary fibre was protective. So people who consume diets higher in dietary fibre, and remember, these are a group of people who tending to have their cereal fibre from things like a low glycemic index type food like porridge, and they're living up there in the Blue Mountains, and that was a big part of their diet. So this, and I just wanted to quickly touch on for you important sources of alternate low glycemic index foods. So this GI is the amount of response for a blood glucose response after 2 hours of measuring the blood glucose after ingestion of a standard amount of the food item. And you can see that jasmine rice is very high response. Whereas if you had some other alternative grain foods, they're lower in GI. And I've given their information about glycemic load too, which is related to carbohydrate content. Getting a little bit techie dietetic-wise here. Now, I just want to touch on flavonoid, importance of flavonoids in diet and its interest in that. So in another part of the study of the Blue Mountains Eye study, where we collected wave dietary food records, we investigated what types of sources of foods were really important from a flavonoid intake point of view. So the big key factors were tea, parsley, oranges, and blueberries. So for different types of flavonoids. And there's increasing interest in relation to flavonoids and their protective effect in relation to health as well. And so then we subsequently had a look at the flavonoid intake from our food frequency questionnaire, which didn't necessarily have assessment of all those factors, but it did have assessment for things like tea and fruit, didn't have the herbs in there. And we found that oranges, when you look back to that factor there, oranges there is the main source of it was flavonoids. I go back to here. Oranges in particular were protective for macular degeneration, reduced the risk at any AMD by almost 60% for late quite a big risk reduction. And it could be the vitamin C content of the oranges, but it could be the flavonoids as well. That's important from a point of view of reducing risk for macular degeneration. And I always like to, this is a great time of year to be eating your oranges and mandarins, and so take full advantage of that. So then we did a clinical trial, and we put all that together. We looked at increased consumption of dark green leafy vegetables, eating fish regularly, choosing low glycemic index foods, eating fish at least twice a week, and having a handful of nuts. That was our basic information we gave to people. We did this as a telephone intervention, and we wanted to see if we could affect behaviour change. So it was a basic clinical trial. We weren't particularly looking at their macular health over time in this trial. What we looked at was to see if we could change behaviour by giving them some regular key messages, very clear instructions about diet. And what we found, we did that with a PhD student, Diana Ting, and she put together a great resource around around all those sort of key messages. But this is a bit of an example of the type of resource that we had, showing people, giving them sort of inspiration for their dark green leafy vegetable consumption. And then what we found was, over the course of the trial, over 3 months, we were able to shift their intake of dark green leafy vegetables, so almost an extra serve per week. Still not what we want them to be eating, every day we'd like them to be having that, but we were able to get some positive change that was significant. They started consuming more legumes, they were low glycemic index foods, and importantly, they reduced their processed food consumption. So compared to the control group, because the control group didn't have this level of change. And they were just given a pamphlet on healthy dietary guidelines. So we were very pleased with that level of behaviour change, because it is really hard to change behaviours. I just want to come back to that notion of the Mediterranean diet that I started with, open with, and just talk about a bit more about this combination of effects that seems to be growing in our understanding importance when you put together some of those elements that I've been describing. And then in the last few minutes, if I may, Mira, just talk briefly about this interest in dementia and macular degeneration. So is that okay, Mira, if I just quickly touch on that for a couple of minutes?
Yep, go for it, Vicki. All good?
Okay, good. Okay, so there was a study that was published that came out of Taiwan, a very large study of looking at that followed over 10,000 participants, looking at macular degeneration and the risk for dementia, in particular Alzheimer's disease. And it wasn't a big risk increase, but I think at a population level, this is a big risk. They found that people who had macular degeneration were increased risk for Alzheimer's disease of 1.2 times, taking into account a number of various confounding factors. And this was just presented here in a Kaplan-Meier plot, where people who had macular lesions in the dotted line had this cumulative incidence of Alzheimer's disease. And I'd like to just sort of ponder on that for a moment and think about what I showed you at the beginning in relation to dementia and the dietary patterns that we know are protective. We know that people who with Alzheimer's disease have amyloid beta plaque increase in their brain tissue. We also know that there's some evidence that in macular degeneration that we see extracellular deposits and in drusen and extracellular deposits in retinal pigment epithelium of amyloid beta plaques. And we also know that both oxidative stress, neuroinflammation are both implicated in macular degeneration and Alzheimer's disease. There's some common genetic studies in relation to those two diseases as well, common gene patterns that are starting to emerge in the literature. This is starting to get a little bit outside my main part of research. I'm more interested in it from the nutrition point of view. We're doing some work currently and looking at low inflammatory diets in liver health, but we're also interested in other health outcomes, and we're starting to explore that further. So this notion, coming back to what I was talking to at the beginning around anti-inflammatory diets, increasing anti-inflammatory foods, reducing pro-inflammatory foods. And we've done some work on producing some healthy recipes that are fun. I have one of my PhD students produced this book, it's Food as Medicine. Sue Rad, that was the work that I mentioned earlier, and she's got some great recipes. Like this is one of the recipes we use in that study as well. And so I will close there, but just wanted to bring it back to that notion of the connection between dementia and macular degeneration. So it's just starting to emerge. But what we know is these types of messages, while we're still gathering the evidence, they are going to be important for our overall health. And so, helping in our vascular health, reducing risk for other chronic diseases. So, and they're not going to be harmful. And so I think there's a good message there around eating healthily overall to reduce risk for macular degeneration and to slow progression of disease.